Hello, my name's Jim and welcome to my YouTube channel. Thank you for tuning in. In this first two parts of this video series, we're going to be working on the 1642 Jet. It's a 1.5 horsepower model, but the 2 horsepower model is basically the same machine. And a lot of other lathes of this type, whether it's the Powermatic 3520, 1440s, the other Jets and other styles of lathes like this, or the Grizzly lathes, this same procedure works for all of those as well. In this video, we're going to cover tearing it down to replace the bearings. At one point, we're going to be looking at how you would and how far you would tear it down just to replace the belt. I would suggest that any time you need to replace the bearings in your lathe, that you also replace the belt. You're in there and it's a pretty inexpensive piece to add to it. Now before we get started on tearing it down, let's talk a little bit about bearings and the kind of bearings and why we may need to replace the bearings in our lathe. Number one, they may be noisy. Number two, they may be loose. And they may be neither of the two. A lot of times a bearing's first indication that it's going out, you may not even notice. Let's say you're having a good day turning. Your skew's working good, your gouge is working good, everything's working good, but your cuts have chatter. That may be an indication that your spindle bearings have gotten play in them. And when you put the force on them, whether it may be from the tailstock or just from the tool itself, it may cause that bearing to move enough to give you some chatter, some rough cuts, and you just can't explain why you're getting the cuts you are. As a wood turner, we know that at some point in time, this is going to be something we face, is changing the bearings on our spindles. We do not need to be afraid of this or be intimidated by it. It's a pretty simple procedure. But for a minute, let's look at bearings. Stay there. Basically, when we talk about bearings, there are two kinds of bearings. There's what's called an open bearing and a sealed bearing. In this area, this open bearing is really open. You can see the balls, the rollers, the tapers, whatever they may be. But when you come to the sealed bearing, there are two kinds of sealed bearings. One is referred to as a shielded bearing. This bearing in my hand fits the Jet 1221, and this is a shielded bearing. It's got a metal shield, and some of the metal shields can be removed, the bearing cleaned, and new lubricant, a good high-speed, high-pressure grease put back in, and the seal put back in. In this one, we have a rubber sealed bearing. This one is sealed that all the contaminants, grease stays in, most of the contaminants stay out. This one is not sealed, it is shielded. The major difference is contaminants can readily enter this bearing. Typically, if your lathe has never had the bearings replaced, this is likely the shielded style of sealed bearing. Again, shielded, sealed. But the shielded will be the one you find typically as an OEM bearing. So let's get busy and go ahead and take this 1642 apart. For this procedure, you're going to need just a few tools. One of those tools is a wooden dowel. I use about a 1 inch. 1 inch is fine. The next thing you're going to need is a very soft-faced hammer. You're going to need a 3mm, 4mm, and 5mm Allen wrench. You're also, for this style of lathe, for this one whose indexing is through the nose of the headstock, what else will be very handy to have is your spindle locking pin. So as you've got your spindle locking pin, your Allen wrenches are laid out, your hammer and your dowel. Let's go ahead and take this lathe apart. The first thing we want to do is be sure the lathe is unplugged. Stop switch is off and the power is turned all of the way down. Next, we unplug the lathe. Don't skip this step, very important. Once the lathe is unplugged, go ahead and open your access door. Notice on the front you've got a large pulley, small pulley. You may need to come back to this later, but just remember that it's there and it's on the door and it's convenient. I'm going to turn on this extra light, help us see in there. Here you see the pulley alignments. You see the belt, upper spindle pulleys, lower motor pulleys, spindle drive, motor drive. Now let's loosen our motor all the way up, pull the lever up, lock our motor so that the belt moves freely. Let's go ahead and move the belt over to the side. Now the first thing we need to do is remove the hand wheel or hand cylinder in the case of this lathe. You'll need a 3mm Allen wrench for that. And I have to tell you ahead of time, I've done this a few times, and this may be one of the most difficult pieces on your lathe to take off. Back these Allen screws out until they're flush with the top of the handle cylinder on this one, or hand wheel. Same thing. Turn it, you can get to the other Allen screw, and now back it out until it's flush, and then put your spindle lock pin, indexing pin, and now work this off. Set it aside. The next thing we want to do while we have our indexing pin in is we want to remove this collar. This is one of the most important pieces of this tear down and rebuild procedure. In part 2, you'll hear me talk about the bearing preload. That bearing preload will determine how long the bearings will last, if they'll last at all, whether they're loose, tight, or just right. So it takes a 5mm Allen wrench. Once it's loosened, just leave the Allen wrench in the Allen socket head screw and turn it counterclockwise on this lathe. Some lathes this may be a left-hand thread. Some lathes it'll be a coarse thread, some lathes it'll be a fine thread, but on this lathe it's a coarse thread, almost like an Acme thread. Remove this collar all the way. This collar has two ways that it can be put on. This side has a raised shoulder. The raised shoulder will go against the inside race of this motor end spindle bearing. This side is flat, and this side will be out toward the hand wheel or hand cylinder for this lathe. Lay this aside. At this point, it's a good idea, your spindle's still held in place, you still got your indexing pin. To remove this cover, for this you'll need a 3mm Allen wrench. And we are doing this video in real time. We may stop it along the way to do some stuff or reset up for another camera scene. I'm not a professional videographer. My granddaughter's actually helping me film this, and she's probably a lot more of a videographer than I am. It seems the younger generation get this stuff a lot better than we do. So once you have the 4 screws out of this, there's a little trick to removing it from the housing. The lathe is unplugged. Again, I can't stress that enough at this point. Our hands are going to be in here. The worst thing we can have happen is to find that we have a bare wire or something like that when we put our hand in here, or a 1.5 or 2 horsepower motor start running unexpectedly. Put your hand in the back and you'll feel the back of this speed display, the digital display. Now just hold it and tilt it out. Gently tilt it straight out. As you do, you're going to notice the sensor eye for the speed indicator. Do not let this get damaged. It has a glass eye on it, literally. It's probably not going to be able to see it in the video, but you don't want to get any fingerprints or oil or grease or anything like that on it. So just let it stay over here to the side. Now we have better access to the spindle drive pulleys. And at this point, we're going to talk about how far down you have to take the lathe in order to replace the belt. Now that all of that's there, don't loosen anything. If all you're doing is replacing the belt at this point, this is all you need to do. Holding the spindle in each hand first, see if it'll come out on its own. If it doesn't come out on its own, you can use a soft-faced hammer if you have one. Holding the spindle with this hand, gently tap the end of this spindle. If it doesn't come out, now you're going to have to get a wooden dowel, something that's going to keep you from damaging the end of this shaft. Gently tap it with this dowel. It's slowly going to begin to move. As it begins to move, just check it. Be sure there's nothing in there that's catching or holding or keeping it from coming through. Once again, gently tapping it. You'll notice that in this case, this wave washer was holding a little friction on it and caused this rear bearing to jump off the shaft. That may happen. Again, we're doing this in real time, folks. This may be what you experience. Once that's done, reach inside and gently pull the spindle out the front. Now, this is a good thing that's happened. Our front spindle bearing has stayed in the shaft inside the housing. What do you do now? Put your hand inside here, gently holding pressure. You'll notice that that spindle nose bearing will come out, and it should very gently push itself back. Now, if you're just replacing the spindle bearing at this time, it's cleared enough that you can remove the belt, put the belt back on, the new belt, and then just put everything back together very slowly. And as you do that, most of the time, this will slide back in with no pressure and no damage to the bearing. Now, since we are planning on replacing the spindle bearings, let's go a little deeper in this lathe. You're now going to need a 4mm Allen socket. Loosen the two. There's typically two, there could be more. Again, loosen these Allen screws, set screws, enough till you know they are going to clear the keyway pins, drift pins. Now, you should be able to move once it's loose. You should now be able to move that drive pulley. Push the spindle forward just a little bit, letting it rest. And now, you'll be able to get to the two Allen screws, again the 4mm, that are on your spindle lock collar. This is different from the indexing. This is the lock collar. Loosen these. You'll notice now it moves. We're now ready to remove the spindle. Put your hand inside and gently begin to remove everything from the housing. You can gently tap if your spindle drive pulley is not wanting to cooperate. You can just gently tap. It kind of acts like a slide hammer. Remove your spindle locking collar. Notice how it's coming out with the large pulley toward the headstock end, smaller pulley toward the motor. Let's go over to the table saw workbench and talk about this shaft a minute. When you're going to replace your bearings in your spindles, on your spindle, it's a good idea. You do not want to open the bearings until you're ready to install them. When you open the bearings, they're going to be covered with a protective coat of grease. Remove all of that, get it cleaned off, get your new bearings laid out, and compare them to the old. The human hand is very sensitive and can typically detect a thousandths or 2/1000ths ripple, ridge, or difference. You'll visually check them, dexterously check them, and be sure you don't mix the old up with the new. We're now ready to finish taking this spindle shaft apart. Remove the keyway and lay it aside. For this particular lathe, you're going to need a 12mm wrench. You're going to have to remove these 4 bolts. These 4 bolts are the pickup indicators for the digital display and speed channel, or speed indicator. Just remove them. They're going to be a little snug because they are in a particularly machined area of this shaft, so that they won't back out once they're tightened. And you'll notice on most of these machines, you're going to notice a flattened area around the bolt. That's what causes it to stay in. Now, if you're working on a Powermatic 3520 and you get into it, what you're going to find is almost this exact same shaft. It actually takes the same bearing that this one does, the difference being the 3520 on the spindle side of the lathe actually takes 2 6207 bearings. Once you've done that, this bearing can be removed. Now, if this bearing is stuck on the shaft, there's several ways to remove it. But if you don't have a bearing splitter, once you've got this shaft in your hand, it would be a real easy thing to take this to an automotive machine shop and have them remove this bearing for you. That way you don't risk damaging this shaft and this machined area of this spindle. Now, I do want to point out on this spindle that you're going to notice a slight shoulder on the back side that's going to fit with the race, the inside piece of this bearing, to hold it from touching the back of the spindle shaft. Let's put the bearing back on. Our new bearing in hand, wiped and cleaned. You can lubricate this shaft and you can lubricate the inside of this bearing. I do not. You can do what you want to, it's yours. You can lube it or not. 30 years ago, working in an automotive machine shop, we were told and trained that if you add lubricant, it can tighten that fit and make this too tight. Slide this onto the shaft very gently. And for this shaft, I'm using a piece of 1.5 inch Schedule 40 PVC pipe. I'm going to slide it down over the shaft. It fits perfectly against this inside race. You do not want to strike the outside of this race, as it will damage your bearings. My pipe's too short, so I'm going to stand another piece just on top. Once again now, with the dead blow hammer and under the towel on top of the table saw workbench is a piece of plywood so that it keeps my spindle from being damaged. Now we can begin, and in this case, it slides easily on. Wipe your shaft off. Now, Here's one thing that you need to look for. On your shaft, where the Allen screws for the locking, for the spindle locking and for the drive pulley, they may have roughed this shaft up a little bit. What I would tell you to do, and do how you will and what you will, the shafts are typically not a really hard steel. I'm going to take a piece of 2000 grit wet or dry sandpaper, and where these two indentions are made, I'm just going to gently go over those. Because what I need to do now, wipe that off. What I want to do now is, before I put the keyway in, I want to be sure that this is going to slide freely on this shaft. This is a very important piece and part of this procedure. If you notice, it stopped right on the tips of where those Allen screws had been. Now if I slide the keyway over where those two had been, that tells me that that's exactly what is binding my pulley from sliding freely. So I know now that I need to work just a little bit more with the 2000 grit, and for this I'm going to take and hold it with my index finger to the point, and I'm gently going to work again on removing those little ridges. This may take a few minutes, so just keep working at it. You're going to notice that actually if you're using 2000 grit, and you can use 1000, you can use 600, you can use whatever, is handy. Don't use 120 or 220 or something like that. It'll just rough it up too much. Okay. Okay, I'll be right back. I'm going to take a little break and get the other bearings and things out and get them ready, and we'll be right back. Okay, well, we're back. I've got the other bearings laid out. Let's be sure our shaft slides freely. Just a little work there, and we're ready to go. Stand our shaft back up, hold on to it so it don't fall on the floor. Start your bolts. You don't have to over tighten these bolts. My daddy used to say to me growing up, if you grit your teeth, you've tightened it too tight. And I would say that rule should apply here as well. Now what I do is I run them up, I get them all and just snug them with the open end of the wrench. Once they're all there, just snug them up. Again, don't grit your teeth, just snug them up good. Remember, they've got a locking area on the shaft. Now, we're ready to reassemble our lathe. Here's a reassembly tip. Be sure everything's clean. Again, if you want to lube this shaft, that's fine. I was taught that you didn't. On your keyway, if you will, just put it back in, and you'll notice there are, again, Allen marks on the keyway, and just turn those up, lay it flat, and we're going to keep this shaft elevated at the 12 o'clock position as we reassemble. So let's go. New bearings in hand for the rear, drive pulley. Let's go put it back together. Thank you for watching my YouTube video. Again, this is part one of a two-part series. Hit the subscribe button if you would, and leave me some comments if you have questions, and we'll see if we can answer them. Again, thank you. And this is Jim in Rock Springs, Wyoming. And thank you again for tuning in. Safe turn.